Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, so I'm going to be looking at some data that I've been working with for about 3, 4, 5 years now. And so I've sort of at the end of the production of articles which are on the way to coming out. So I'm going to be revisiting some of that. And also at the end trying to address the theme, which was to do with whether conversation analysis is relevant in the era of big data. Well, I'm going to make a start. I'm going to mention it not at the start, but right at the end to try and bring some threads together. And hopefully that will lead to some discussion when we have the roundtable discussion. And maybe even Steve will pick up some of those threads. Who knows? Okie doke. So what I'm looking at is collaborative computer-assisted writing. And I'm going to be focusing on one aspect of that, which is spelling correction, which is at least a narrow enough thing to stick to in this particular study. And at the same time, I'm wanting to look at the epistemic ecology of this and the area of epistemics and what that might bring us in terms of thinking about learning. Okay, so how and to what extent does the epistemic ecology of collaborative computer-assisted writing provide for epistemic progression? I'll come back to this. And thus learning opportunities when spelling problems arise. And then secondly, by looking at this question, I will also want to address how multimodal conversation analysis and epistemics can help us in our understanding of learning processes. So, I think you've seen these sorts of things already, so I've just grouped all these because they've already been talked about, but I want to remind us, and I want to come back to these at the end when we consider big data and what these principles and aims might add to how we could consider these aspects of the conversation analysis in relation to big data. So the main aim, of course, is to sort of uncover interactional patterns that we orient to, that people orient to in their everyday lives, and in this case in collaborative writing. So we have the emic perspective and action perspective, multimodal interaction analysis, looking at different, as they're writing, obviously conversation analysis is a bit of a misnomer here. It would perhaps be more accurate to talk about interaction analysis rather than conversation analysis. And then transcriptions. This is also a challenge when we're not really focusing on talk, but concentrating on what's being written and how talk contributes to what's being written, then this actually creates some sort of challenges for transcriptions. So I've worked out a way of trying to put the focus back on writing rather than, or not put it back, but put the focus on writing. Yeah, one thing which maybe hasn't come up so much is validation. Well, we haven't talked about it, but of course we've been doing it all the time, because how we validate our own data is through what we did yesterday, a data session where we all gather around one piece of data and all contribute to and build on each other's analyses, reject some on the way, and by the end of a data session, usually everybody feels all the wiser for having done this. And I think that's what we experienced yesterday, after lots of clever things, but as well as some things which maybe we reject on the way. And then obviously through presentations of data like I'm going to be doing now, this is also a way of validating our work. And of course through transcriptions, where we make this process of analysis transparent to each other and open to scrutiny. And, of course, in the publications where we also reproduce these transcriptions and then invite others to see, well, do I agree with the analyses? And, of course, in the review process, we find that often others don't exactly agree with everything we write, and we have to make adjustments. So this is an extremely important part, which I want to come back to when we talk about big data, this transparency of the process. And another aspect which we haven't maybe raised in this fashion, it's the ecological validity of what we do. We go out and try to capture the types of activities that are already being done in classrooms, for example. And that's what I've done with my research. So, and this is to do with generalizing our findings to similar settings where people will be working in classrooms. So the extent to which research findings would generalize to other settings which are typical of everyday life, say, in our case, the classrooms. And often we talk about this in terms of collecting naturally occurring data, which is a bit of a misleading term, I think. But this is what it's about. Okay. We haven't really said so much about this either, well, at least not systematically like this. So I wanted to raise this now because my work is and of course not just my work, but the work that's been presented up until now is based either on single case analyses, where, especially if you're looking at investigating something for the first time, to find, well, what patterns might there be, to see, okay, when you've looked at one case, then you can start looking at others to see if there are similarities. And then we're on to building collections to try and generalize the features across different contexts to discover what's context-free, what can recur all over the place, and what might be context-sensitive that's produced in situ for the particular contingencies that arise in that situation. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this collection process, partly because this is the biggest collection I'm going to be I'm not going to present the whole collection in that sense, but I have almost 440 examples that I looked at, so I'm never going to do a big collection like this again because it's a bit of a nightmare, but at least spelling corrections, they're relatively easy to identify and collect, so I've done this. So this is as big a data as I'm ever going to get, I think. So the first step is, of course, after identifying your phenomenon that you want to look at, locating the action sequences. Then characterizing these actions. And why I'm presenting this is also because it's part of our method that we all use, and it's also part of then what we accept as and expect to be there as a validation and a transparency in our method. So we look at, for example, at the characterize the actions by looking at the participation framework. So who is involved, who initiates, who performs actions, do particular people perform these things? And in my case, it's also going to be the computer doing some of those actions. And of course, it's important not just to look at talk, but how talk is laminated with other modalities. And then our sequential analysis, which is one of our strengths. So we look at what precedes it, if it's responding to anything, its sequential position, like first pair parts that we've already been considering. How is it responded to? How is it completed? What actions are being performed? Because we're interested in actions as well. And then finally, this is based on Seed House. It's a compact version of this. How we package our actions and this relationship between form, that often these two things come together, but we may use different forms to do similar things as well. So that's something that we would be interested in discovering through this analytic process. So, a few words about correction. I'm not going to say so much about this because that's not really the focus here. But I'm using correction rather than repair because I'm interested in particular, the replacement of a trouble item by another. I mean, that's what spelling correction is about. You identify something that's normatively wrong and you correct it. However, I say normatively wrong, but of course participants have to decide what's normatively wrong. So taking this emic perspective means that what they deem as incorrect and what the computer marks as incorrect gets treated as wrong, or at least potentially wrong, and has to be sorted out in the process, which can of course cause problems too. So spelling correction, the trajectories of how you correct spellings, they are very similar to, and that's maybe what we would expect, the structure that we find in repairs, this three-part structure, where you get the emergence of a trouble source, but that's not there to start with. It only appears retroactively after somebody or something has initiated correction. And in this case, it could, as it's collaborative writing, it could be by the person who's typing, the typist, the non-typist, the other, or it could be the computer, the spell checker. And then there's a correction outcome. Sometimes this outcome is nothing, but I haven't done so much counting of those, although we might look at a case. I don't think we've got time to look at everything I have in that handout. You might get a bit of a shock, or already have had a shock. Is he really going to go through all those? No, probably not. Okay, so this, because we have this, at least a potentially triadic participation framework, although it doesn't come into all of the cases that I'm looking at, because one of the things that happens when you're out in the field recording is that, yeah, well, it's subject to the contingencies of that particular environment, where they're working on laptops which are just available at the school. The school is, in this case, is a Swedish school, and the normal language of that school is Swedish. And so what happens in the language lessons when they use the laptops? Well, in fact, by this ecological validity that I was talking about, it became very interesting to see that, there are things that maybe we haven't really considered that cause problems in this type of environment where laptops are being used in different languages. So that's part of what I discovered in my findings by not doing the sort of thing which many others have done, look at the potential of spell checkers to correct spellings under the most ideal conditions. Yeah, well, it can do this and it can do that. Well, I've discovered that it doesn't do very much of it, actually, in everyday use. Okay, so the participants here, I have got more data, but I've been focusing in particular on 4 pairs of students who were doing from one particular upper secondary school, year 10, so they're 17-year-olds, and I've got about 13 hours of video that I've been looking at. That's what produced these 440 examples in my collection, and the recordings are with 2 cameras. There's one focusing on the screen, and for reasons of, well, for ethical reasons, those are the videos that we're going to be looking at right now. And these were collected by my teacher students who worked on this data as well as me. And the task that we're interested in here is they're writing about famous Americans. They've chosen different ones, and we're at different stages in the writing process. Okay, so as I said, there's a potential triadic framework. So one of the ways in which I've categorized this data is to identify self-initiated, self-corrections. These are the categories that appeared in the data. Self-initiated, so the typist initiates repair and corrects it. It can also be initiated by the other student next to them, but then it's the typist usually who does the correction. The computer can initiate through red underlinings, usually, and then the person who's the typist corrects. Yeah, then we have, I'm not going to touch that now. Then we have computer-initiated computer corrections, so the spell checker takes over and just changes something. But that's actually limited agency as well. And then the non-typist can initiate correction and then take over. So that's not so rare, but we're going to see a case of that. And then that's also fraught with problems if you do that. And then the last one, where the computer initiates correction and then the other person corrects it. Okay, and as you can see here, the biggest group, because there are preference structures in this, which I'll come back to afterwards, but it's skewed very much towards self-initiated self-corrections. Come back to why, but it's partly to do with the timing of this. But I'm going to focus on these ones, because I'm interested in the agency of the computer and also the other person who's not typing. Okay, then my transcriptions. Because writing is paramount in this has been marked in bold. So anything in bold is what's being typed on the keyboard, and it's also signaled, can I do that carefully? Yeah. By this computer sign. When it's talk, it's marked by a talking head. And then where these disks are, this shows something from either the document or a screenshot from the side, depending on what might be relevant to help us see what's going on. In addition, if anything's crossed out, like that N is crossed out, it's deleted text. And then if anything is in square brackets like this, I've just added it to help it, even though here the only change that happened was deleting the N. But it's a bit difficult to read it if you don't know what the N belongs to. So the square brackets show that things that have already been typed. Yeah, I think those are the most important things. Yeah, and then the centered dots as well just show there's a space, because that has a relevance. Because when you have a space, that's when the red underlinings start appearing. If you don't have a space, nothing happens. So it's quite important for us to see those. Yeah, okay, so this is an example, the first example, which is divorced, which should be divorced. And this is in some ways a rather uninteresting case, but we'll start with this because it's fairly straightforward. So this is the problem item, and it's not what I would say is a genuine spelling error, but it's a typo. And typos are usually sorted out pretty quickly. But it's also signaled by the red underlining that we have in the... So it becomes noticeable when you get a red underlining like this in the text. So this is computer initiated, even though it might have been noticed otherwise. So sometimes we can't always tell. So I let it run. Not much is being said here because this pair are quite quiet actually. So I'll let it run and then we'll come back to what's going on. Okay. This is obviously our trouble source, and it's computer initiated. The spell checker has this underlining to show that it's spelt wrong after the space has been typed. And then it's self-corrected in a number of steps here. So we can see this is quite typical, that rather than use the left click to get up suggestions, that's hardly ever used, actually. And only 2 out in my data. That is, of course, I can't generalize to all data sets or what you do, but it was quite a surprise to me that this feature was hardly ever used. So most of it looks like this. You delete back and then retype. And I think it's to do with the progressivity of the typing, actually, that it's otherwise you have to change your fingers and do other things. And they're working on laptops, so it's easier to delete and then retype, I think, for the progressivity of this. And even so, this has already started, the self-correction, but we get what could have been an other initiation. Somebody reading, this is how it can often look. You read the word out as if it's actually written. It's one of the methods of showing, indicating, displaying to others that there's something wrong here. Diagnostic. Yeah, and then he sort of gets a bit annoyed and does it really heavily. You can see he lifts up his hands and bashes at the keyboard at this, and that causes fat finger syndrome, where your finger goes in between 2 of the keys, and so he ends up typing a D and an F, which are next to each other on the keyboard. So this is one of the typical types of errors or typos that can appear. So this becomes a new trouble source. So this gets chained once, and then we get a self and other correction, because this time adult, that's the non-typist, he reads out the word as it should be this time round. But this happens at the same time as Adam retype or deletes the final F. So this sort of happens at exactly the same time. So self and other initiation, it's impossible to really tell, as they both come together. Okay, so that's a fairly simple case. In the first case, an omission, a typo that was an omission, and in the second case, I put correction summaries at the end, but I'm not going to go use these again, but they're in the handouts. Okay, now I want to come to epistemics, because there's not really much going on that's of any interest there, but I want to contrast that example with, well, what happens if you don't know? And because that's more interesting from our perspective, from a learning perspective, than if you do know how to correct it. So, central to making corrections is accessing, managing, and producing knowledge, new knowledge, if you don't have it. And epistemics is a growing area. And just quite recently, I think it was this week, a new issue came out of all about epistemics and a rebuttal of a previous issue of discourse studies. So it's a sort of an exciting, vibrant area at the moment to be doing work in. At least this makes things a little bit easier for me, because I think I heard that there was a sudden sort of gap where people didn't dare write stuff on epistemics, and I just carried on anyway. So now it's a bit more comfortable now, again. So this work has been extended to the language classroom, where of course knowledge and learning are of paramount concern. So my colleagues, distinguished colleagues here, have also done some work in this area, which has been useful for me. It's come out recently. They've already talked a bit about it. And here we come again. So one of the things that Olcay and Ufuk have have looked at is the co-construction of knowledge. This has already come up. So, and in collaborative writing, of course, this is the whole point of having collaborative writing, of course. If they're going to work individually and nobody's going to do anything together, it's of course of no point pedagogically at all. So if we have the co-construction of knowledge, then maybe we should expect to see examples of epistemic progression where knowledge is bridged, where a gap in somebody's knowledge is potentially bridged. So reducing this knowledge asymmetry between different parties, in this case, between the typist and the non-typist. And I've done work with this together with Asta Čekajte at Linköping University. This is, it's not very easily accessible because it's in a volume, unfortunately, but we've used this term epistemic ecology to look at how knowledge is scaffolded from different semiotic resources. And we've borrowed this term from Goodwin, which has also been used by Melander. So a bit more about that. So an epistemic ecology is a notion that encompasses the public distribution and organization of knowledge and the dynamic relationship between different participant positions when it comes to knowledge. So there are two features which I think, I've already mentioned these, which are relevant, that actions are regularly and characteristically transformed through human cooperation. And then, as a result, these transformative actions co-construct knowledge from multiple resources, which can lead to epistemic progression, potentially. And then drawing on the work of Stivers et al., I'm mostly going to be using the term epistemic access here, but epistemic primacy and epistemic responsibility come into the picture as well. There are moral undertones as well. So epistemic access, participant states of knowing, not knowing, and of course it's what's displayed in interaction rather than what's going on inside people's heads that we're interested in here. And then also the certainty of whether they think they know things or not. Epistemic primacy, it presupposes that there are asymmetries. We know different things, and then we orient to those differences in interaction. And so it's not necessarily that okay, the computer is always right, because it isn't actually. So this is something that gets established through interaction, for example. So what becomes, this is a dynamic position. So what may be given epistemic primacy may change and be rejected. So this is something worked out. And epistemic responsibility, where the interactants treat each other as responsible. So if you're doing collaborative writing, there is the moral aspect, or you're going to have your work assessed. It's a joint effort, so it's understood that you have a contract with each other to try and work at making sure that the piece of work that you're doing is as correct as possible, which often means looking at spellings. So I would say in this data, whether from a normative perspective, because spelling is very normative, is about 95% of 95% of the spellings that they correct, they actually produce correctly. So the work that they do is it usually leads to a correct result. Okay, now we're going to turn to, in turn, two different types of scenarios. Correction, which is facilitated by the spell checker. We've already looked at one, where, and then we're going to contrast that with an example of where there is a problem a bigger problem, a genuine problem. So we've already seen this one. So I've marked here also whether we get K+, in other words, somebody who establishes or something that gets treated as having epistemic access. So in this case, the computer initiated, oh, these have gone off the edge of the screen. Strange, but okay. I'll read them out anyway. And then self-correction that is done shows also that the person who corrects it can identify what's wrong, because the underlining doesn't show exactly what's wrong as it stands there. So you've got to fix. Usually the typist fixes it and identifies, well, what's the problem? And here it's the V that's being missed, which pops up here. And we get other things that appear in this case. We get like a tutting, like, oh, now I've made a silly mistake, and now it's shown that it's got a red underlining. So this is an indication of sort of an annoying slip. And yeah, this other initiation here, it comes late after. It comes after the correction is already underway, in fact. So the person has already identified that there's a problem here. So apart from actually noticing the underlining and fixing it, there doesn't seem to be any problems or any need for epistemic progression in terms of knowledge or knowledge gains. Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's because I'm trying to these lines I didn't say at the beginning, but these happen concurrently. So this indicates that the I comes when there, and the V comes at the point where he says there. So he also says, I hate this. It's sort of a meta comment, also showing that this is really annoying when I'm typing. So blaming it on the computer, really. Because, yeah, and I mean, because it's collaborative, it's also an important, these things get verbalized as well, vocalized. Okay, this particular case, Sicker Hands, is they're doing a project on Tim Burton, and there are two things going on. There's quite a lot of talk, but most of the talk is not to do with this. You know, it's actually quite interesting from another perspective, because one of them uses this word rabble. And rabble, she means like to rattle off a list of names. Let's rabble, and then the other one doesn't understand what she's saying. So that project is going on alongside the one which is fixing, writing Edward Scissorhands here. So this is excerpt 2. And so this is what appears. We get a red underlining from Word. So indicate that this is not correct, and then it's got to be fixed. So so you're going to hear a lot of talk. These girls speak non-stop, all the time. But as I say, keep your eyes on what's going on down here, and then occasionally you might hear something which is of relevance. If you miss it, I will come back to it and show what bits of it are relevant for our purposes right now.
And we have, maybe we should just like, when we do the presentation, maybe we should just like, no, not like rabble, because then it makes...
And rabble, what do you...
No, rabble, like...
Rap.
I don't know if that's even an English word, but now it is. Okay, I've invented it. So if we do like, his made Edward Scissorhands, chocolate factory, blah, 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 because then I think that... really shows that he's done a lot and a lot of different, like, because we don't want to miss out on something really.
That's how you spell this?
Yeah, that's how you spell scissors.
I don't know. I actually have no idea how you spell.
Oh yeah. Okay. On the first, this is where it first appears that we actually get a sort of. She pauses and she slows down in the middle of her typing, and she says, "How do you spell that?" So it could be sort of voicing her own problems to herself, or it could be sort of a request for help. It's a bit unclear because they both look like this. So she's displaying that she doesn't know before she spells it. That, oh. The other girl, Sarah, she just carries on talking. Regardless, she ignores the question, and she's got her own project on the go, which is rattling off these names. And then this stops this project in its as it goes along. So here we get the underlining. So it's marked as a trouble source by the computer with this red underlining. Then we get something which is rather interesting. I haven't seen any other examples of this in the data. This is quite creative. That obviously she's worked out that hands is not the problem. It must be the first bit. So she's divided these, and then she starts using the right-click function to work as a diagnostic tool, which Asta Čekaite discovered in her study. But it doesn't work quite because the spell checker works on edit distance, and so if you've got 3 or more letters wrong, it can't often identify the word. So even though it can be helpful, it's not that helpful if you get it too wrong, which is the case here, because we've got too much wrong. So it doesn't provide the word. So this becomes a new trouble. Well, it becomes a trouble source. She gets a help request, which shows that she doesn't know how to do this. Then we get a try at correcting this. She deletes the C's. This takes a while because she gets entangled in working out what the other girls Sarah's talking about in the meantime. And then she replaces these with S's. But it seems as though she's trying this out. So will it fix it? Will it? Won't it? And then it gets a red underlining again. So a computer initiated, and it's a new trouble source, which I forgot to mark there. And then the computer shows, well, at least it's treated as being correct here, that it's still got epistemic access, and I haven't in this case. So we get another attempt at requesting help from the computer, from the spell check. And this time, the word is actually there. And so this is her help, the continuation of the help request. And then we get one of these change of state epistemic markers. Now she's found, well, she can see the word there, and she selects it from this. So we get a step which she has to do then as a self-correction, because the computer doesn't do it itself. She has to select the right one, which she does there. And then we also get other sort of comments to show her epistemic state. So that's how you spell it. So we get the change of state marker and here as well. And then, not really well timed, we get, yeah, that's how you spell it. That's how you spell scissors, because she's been busy with her own project from the non-typist, who seems to have, well, at least suggests that she knew all along, but it didn't help. Yeah. So what else could we say here? It also shows that there are, even though the computer steps in and there's some agency, which the computer and the spell checker has, it actually has its limitations. It produces these underlinings, but it doesn't unless you click, and then maybe it won't help, and it didn't help in this case. Well, she doesn't even bother to try, actually. But when she does start using the right-click function, it doesn't actually help. So it has its limitations. Usually, the typist tries to sort it out and tries to identify the problem first. She also perhaps makes a potential request to the other girl, but who doesn't actually help or doesn't even seem to notice what she's up to. And then the other problem is the edit distance is too great. So, but she has a fairly creative use, if we could use that term, I'm not sure about it any longer, of this diagnostic tool, or treating the spell checker as a diagnostic tool. So I think here we get a case of epistemic progression, which is signaled by the things that I've marked in blue here to show that a gap has been bridged with the help of the spell checker. Okay. The final thing is she removes that gap as well. Okay, so we're going to move over. Let's see how we're doing for time. Correction facilitated by collaboration. The first one is quite quick. I'll go speed up a bit. So this is rather uninteresting. It's just a letter that's been missed out, and now the language functions are being switched off. So this means that the only help that can be had is from the other person. It's the same two girls again, Anna and Sara, and this is the problem. No underlining because the spell checker isn't switched on. Okay, this is the way it plays out.
Certain themes.
Certain.
Certain.
Okay. So there's our trouble source. We get an other initiation, which shows at the same time that she has epistemic access. That is Sara. She says certain with this emphasizing the R, which has been missed in the rhotic quality of the vowel. And then we also get this oi, like, a bit like the tutting that we had earlier, that, I made a slip here, whoops. And then she sorts it out straight away by placing the cursor, in this case, because she's already typed another word in between, so she goes back to that word. Otherwise, that's quite rare in the data. But often, if more things have been typed, then you might actually move the cursor and go back. And of course, you can't just leave it, because otherwise, well, that would go against the preference structures. If somebody's pointed out a problem, you've got to fix it, basically. And then she adds the R. So this is rather uninteresting as well, but I want to contrast it with the next case. Again, the spell checkers switched off. The word lead gets written, and it should be led. This sentence is at the top, is the one that's being written, typed. One of their homes, yeah.
You said the spell checker didn't switch off. Was this they switched it?
No, it's just, if it's not on, they don't bother.
It wasn't that they did.
No, usually they can't be bothered to do it. This is part of what happens. So this is the epistemic, the epistemic ecology in this case is that, well, you've only got the other person. And the other case, which we're probably not going to be getting to, is so when it's switched to the wrong language, which means that all sorts of confusion can arise. But we'll contrast that with the previous case now. So one of their homes was situated near an Air Force base. One of the homes, and then which led to, it should be, and he spelt it wrong. So this is what happens.
Led.
Which side? Or two?
Skip the A.
Bigger.
No. Skip the A in lead. So it's led.
Oh.
Yeah. Good boy. Just kidding.
Which led to
Two.
Okay. There's some stuff that you didn't see from the side, but I'll show some pictures of it so that we can see. So this was our trouble source, and an other initiation here, EA, skip the A, he says. But this leads to confusion because he's, at the same time as he does that, the other one's just written an A, but it's like a big So skip the A, so he self-correct, that becomes a trouble source, the A, which gets deleted there. And then he's just left with which led to big. And then we get this, no, skip the A in lead. So what we get here is, first of all, this repeated no. It's from Stivers to 2004. When it's an in-progress course of action, you get this. So he's already in the process of trying to fix it, but it's not right. So we get this quite sort of forceful response, and then a greater degree of precision in identifying where the problem is. So to start with, he just said skip the A. Well, EA, and then skip the A. So it was getting increasingly precise. That's what happens when it can't be fixed. So it gets added with increments to try and identify it. But what happens is he just deletes big, because it seems as though there's a problem in identifying what is the problem. I can't see it. Can't see what it is here, and which is what Sid picks up on. And can you see he slips his hand in between the other guy's hand and takes over the keyboard. This doesn't happen very often. So we get this is a new trouble source, and then the other steps in. I have epistemic access, I know how to do it, and I'm fixing it. And then what's the response from the other one? Well, we get these change of state tokens as well. Lead O. So which seem to suggest here that at the very least he didn't notice that where the problem was, and possibly it seems that, well, very probably that, well, he didn't know that he spelt. And of course, lead and lead as the metal is actually spelt like that as well. They're homographs, homophones. And then we get all sorts of, because he's now taken over the keyboard, we get other problems. So now I've gone against the preference structure. You don't take over the keyboard. So now you've got to fix this. So we get, first of all, I'm sorry, we get laughter, we get good boy, self-ironizing. He pats him on the shoulder and says, just kidding, okay? And then he turns to the camera and says, just kidding. So it requires quite a lot of interactional work to have overstepped the mark, even if in this case. So it's not just a question of epistemic progression. If you overstep the mark, you've got to do some sort of repair work in the social department to reduce face threats, and with mitigating laughter and that sort of behavior, which becomes very evident there. Okay, and so I think this idea of the epistemic ecology with laminated resources can be a way of this conceptualizing and bringing out this distribution of the mobilization of knowledge resources, which are made available in this either dyadic or triadic participation framework. So in order to show this epistemic progression. In terms of the spell checker, so now I'm drawing on stuff that I haven't really shown you, but it's drawn on the work from the whole collection. That most of the spelling corrections are initiated and corrected by, I should say, sorry, spell checker, not grammar checker. And then the typist, is the one who mostly shows epistemic access by fixing these problems. But the computer can play this limited agentive role by initiating corrections. That's the most obvious case. But it's not always that fine-tuned to the problems that learners of English have. And so sometimes the spell checker does actually, well, they have to discover that it doesn't have epistemic access. It's often treated as having epistemic primacy, but they can discover if it's not set right, it's all wrong. But sometimes that's a journey they have to make to discover that. Still written grammar checker. Spell checker continued. And then there's the problem of the language tools. If they're tuned wrong, we get problems. I'm not going to go through those because I want to get to big data as well. Collaboration, that aspect of it. So unknowing or epistemic uncertainty can lead to requests for help to the other, sometimes to the computer as well by right-clicking. Of course, if you're going to get help from the other person, they have to have epistemic access themselves. So this is something that has to be discovered through interaction. The other student can notice and sort of heed the corrections and then point this out. And then they have this joint epistemic responsibility for the text that's in the making. So collaboration can take place in other ways as well, because they're often dictating or verbalizing parts of the text together. And spelling. I thought I'd removed all of them. So it should say spelling. The problems, aspects of the spelling emerge, and then they have to negotiate these. So who's right to, and establish whether negotiate this together. Then aspects which I haven't talked about so much to do with the structural organization, the timing of this. So the typist gets the first chance to see, because as it's produced letter by letter, as soon as a letter's produced and it's noticed, then it gets changed immediately. So the non-typist doesn't have a chance to react usually, and then it's not until you've got a space at the end that the computer can do anything. So most of the errors are corrected before that. So this is part of the preference structure. It's structural organization. So the computer usually gets the second chance because that happens as soon as you hit the space bar. And then the other student gets the last opportunity for things if it's switched on correctly, that is. But the typist has the final veto. Okay, so that's all I've got time to say about this. So let's come on to big data. Well, I had to discover, well, what is all this stuff really? So I can't say I'm in the know, but I actually found some stuff which I think we can address here. So I mean, start with the definition: the retrieval of large amounts of information by means of sophisticated computer-based programs. And there seem to be two main types of this big data: structured data, which are numbers and words that are easily categorized, and then unstructured data, more complex data, which has to be gathered from multimedia sources. And of course, this is where I am in this data set. This is what we would need to do some other types of categorization. For example, with usage-based, where you do searches, and also where we have linguistic, what's it called now? The names escape me. Where we do searches through huge amounts of data. Yeah, well, the annotation and speech, yeah. Well, concordancing. Yeah, corpus linguistics, sorry. Yeah. So corpus linguistics, thank you for that. Thank you for bridging my, providing some epistemic progression. At least I knew to start with. I just needed to have my memory jogged. I promise. Okay, that's easy to do if you're working with the type of data that I've been used, where this actually is quite complicated, looking at all and gathering and putting together this picture. So we'll come back to some aspects of that in a moment. unstructured data. And then what do you do with that data once you've got it? Well, I think this was actually quite interesting as well. These were out of 3 things that I discovered that somebody said that the main point of doing data mining is uncovering patterns, pattern detection. So looking for the ones that you already know, that there should be other ones there, like this, or this hypothesis generation, which seems to be, okay, let's start with the data and see, is there anything here which strikes me, sort of unmotivated looking, seems to be what this is, which are part of what we do, actually. And this was a comment by somebody who's an expert in this field, Michael Berthold, who is the head of a company which does this data mining in Germany. So ideally, you have a system that presents interesting connections patterns to a user, and she says, what the heck is that? And after some thinking, this is from an interview, and exploring where that connection comes from creates an entirely new question that's then answered using the data. This sounds quite like Saks's talk about, yeah, we take a bunch of data and then we look at and see, well, does it tell us anything? And then, yeah, well, let's look. So this sounds pretty much like the sorts of things we do, which was rather interesting. Then some more challenges and issues that came that I noticed. And I didn't have to look far for this. In this article that was Critical Questions for Big Data, the mythology of big data offering a higher form of intelligence and knowledge with the aura of truth, objectivity, and accuracy. And then saying, well, working with big data is still subjective, and what it quantifies doesn't necessarily have a closer claim on an objective truth. So how do you make this process visible to the people who you're writing for, which is what we spend a lot of effort actually doing in our work. And then this was rather interesting. This was a crucial problem is that we don't know much about the underlying empirical microprocesses that lead to the emergence of the typical network characteristics of big data. Well, this is precisely where we are. This is what we focus on. What are these empirical microprocesses that are out there? How do phenomena arise? How does learning, and the epistemic progression and so on? And often we, another aspect of this which was added to this, so we often have very strong assumptions that mathematical properties, which may or may not reflect what's actually going on at the level of microprocesses. So how do you get there? Well, I think we have a method to focus on exactly that. A couple of other issues. Back to this interview where the head of this company who does big data mining says that there's a tendency for analyses to become a lot more shallow when more data is available. So this was a rather interesting. So how do you get in-depth analysis? Well, and see that it works across your collection. So I mean, we've developed these collection and a methodology for doing this. And then another aspect which I thought was rather interesting, that a lot of big data problems aren't big analytics problems, but ETL, which is the data extraction, transforming, and loading, which we spend a lot of time doing with conversation analysis, that we gather our data, we create transcripts from that data, and put elements together which we think are relevant, which from an emic perspective, so this emic perspective is not one that can be easily captured, I think, in big data analyses. How do you do that? I have no idea what those algorithms might be. So running the analysis is actually not maybe the problem, but actually having a basis to do the analyses. And that's, of course, what we spend a lot of time working with in conversation analysis and making this whole process transparent. to others. And then there's this privacy and personal integrity, big brother issue. And last week I had to fill in details of what personal data I'm using in my research in digital format. Don't know if it's come to you yet. It's part of Linköping University's fitting in with a law which is coming into effect in May in the EU, which means that we have to know what we're doing. Otherwise, the university can be subject to huge fines. So this is part of what we spend a lot of time with our data. We have letters of consent and so on, and make sure that the ethical aspects are sort of kept under wraps as well. So I thought these were a few things that I found, which I thought these are aspects that we can address with the sort of methodology that we've developed within conversation analysis. So that's it. And I hope we can come back to some of those things in the discussion later on as well.
Perfectly timed as well. Time for questions or comments.
Olja.
I find this very inspiring, Nigel. And then I believe that, first of all, I think what makes me think is it creates potential for two future research directions. One of them is more on the micro side, and then the other one is related to, I think, big data. And I know that you already have worked on a collection of 440 cases, so you don't want to do more work on this. But I'm sure someone else maybe will take up. I would love to if I have the resources. The first aspect goes back to what you mentioned on your, I think it was the 5th slide, computer-initiated or self or other initiated correction, and then there could be a risk of that having noticing actually. So there is this gray point where maybe it is not known whether it is the computer or the self, because the student herself or himself may have noticed that. And then from a descriptive perspective, since a lot of gaze work is going here, and then I know that we talked about this before, but then an eye tracking device with the students, and then because that eye tracking device will give you statistically the fixation rates, and then it will synchronize vocal resources with where they are looking at. And then it will measure exact in microseconds where they look at, with what duration, and then the saccades as well. Therefore, it will tell you very accurately whether it is there is noticing going on there or not. Because I think it's very important at the descriptive level. So that would be
when I see both of them come together, I obviously, that's where you might have seen there's like half cases there, because when I can't work it out, I've divided it so that we still end up with the same number of. And sometimes analytic you can't see, well, which one came. But there's a problem with this, and that is the ecological validity of this. If you're out in schools using the stuff which they are using in situ, which was part of this, then you have to set this up, and it's...
it becomes very experimental, I know. And then there are still technical issues, like a researcher will still have to be there present and recalibrate the eye tracking device, because they will be looking other places. Therefore, there will be a problem if the eye tracking device is connected to the screen. Plus, it has to be at least 300 hertz. Otherwise, it won't give you the level of morphological accuracy which you need for this kind of work, I think. So that was the micro part. Like,
it would have been good.
I would love to see that. There's work on joint attention and all that, but with this one in particular, because, with spelling, how they fix that. That also takes us to the bigger picture, where if you have collections of, let's say, all these mistakes made by students and then getting corrected by the students, by the computer, then it can take us to different directions in terms of, for example, with Swedish learners of English, I noticed that, for example, possessive form is a big problem. So far, that's what I have noticed. I don't know if you would agree.
Yeah.
So the mark, suffixes, and then it's an issue. So the company, well, a word processor company actually would benefit a lot from your findings, if you want to
You want
sell
to become
these
rich
findings
like
to them.
Elon Musk.
A form of algorithm can be maybe created,
yeah.
and then machine can learn that, so that the for Swedish learners then something can be created that would help them actually learn as they write.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a machine that will fix all that problems, because then probably they won't learn. I don't know, maybe they will, but if it's automatically fixed all the time, then that's not helping. But then a teaching methodology there for helping them learn from these mistakes, and then again looking at it in terms of how it emerged in interaction, another way to go. So one direction to go maybe for your collection also, I would say, like, see the types of corrections going on there and then feed back into practice.
Yeah. But I wonder if it's probably not CA that's going to be able to produce that sort of data. That's probably where you can use big data, which has been collected in another format, and identify where are these corrections made. Because this is too small, probably too small.
But your work, combining vocal and written form, gives us access to understanding and learning. That's the value.
Of course.
Without that in isolation would be dry. Only
it's true.
recognition of patterns by the computer itself, then that wouldn't give us that kind of rich understanding of how they create these epistemological ecology and then sort problems out together. So that's why it's very important when CA is there.
That's true.
And then that also brings richness to this line of work, which is called out loud drafting. There is work on that. When people come together and write, it's called out loud drafting, and then it has been subject to research before. We have looked at that as well in group work with multilingual students in Luxembourg. But then, of course, there was always this limitation that access to what they write isn't always very possible. And then with this one, since people are working with computers now, it's a new level for out loud drafting research. And
certainly this data will allow me to do that, and I'm continuing to do. Now I've just presented stuff on spelling, but I'm looking at all sorts of revisions that are being made, and of course, well, what are they doing when they're writing collaboratively? It's like there's lots of ideal thinking about this, and in fact it looks very, very different between these different groups. I don't know how to do that yet, but I've been thinking about it because as I say, there were two of the girls who we were looking. They just talk non-stop. And then they say that we've got nothing written down. Well, because but I mean, but wow, their conversations, I mean, it's impressive, the sorts of stuff that they're doing and sorting out vocabulary and, we do all sorts of stuff in that data, whereas the two of the boys hardly say anything to each other at all. They're the ones that we started looking at, pointing occasionally, so collaboration actually looks quite different too. Thank you. As long as it's not 440 examples collection. Then Steve.
Maybe in addition to what you asked, I don't remember the slide, but in one of the slides there was the noticing first and then initiation next. So, I mean, what is the criteria for noticing in that case? Or maybe they are the same thing with initiation in some
I think,
cases?
yeah, I mean, we can't, when I say noticing, of course, it's noticing and displaying, I'm noticing.
Like moving the
Yeah,
cursors?
yeah, so I mean, I can't say noticing as, because this is but what, displaying that I am doing something, so that would be, it would be re-specifying noticing. In our terms, that how I'm displaying, and this is often in collaboration. They often do this much more than display for each other what I'm seeing. So that's one of the advantages of looking at collaborative writing rather than individual writing. So there was a sort of ulterior motive of focusing on this, because you get more of a foothold on what they're up to, because they have to display it to each other. So that's how I would. So I can't remember how I used it there.
I mean, it was just, you were using the word.
Yeah. Yeah.
They notice first, and then the trajectory shows up, but they notice first, and then the initiation comes
Yeah.
later. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe another question.
Yeah.
What was the instruction? I mean, what were they supposed to do? I mean, they were at some point instructed to have the best text ever, so be careful with the spellings. Was it part of the...
But I mean, they know that it's subject to general grading, so there weren't many instructions about how this. They just had to write a written report about a famous American. So I have actually got the recordings of how this was presented. I mean, I know the written instructions that were given, but it doesn't say so much about it doesn't say anything about spellings. It doesn't say anything about processes of writing and make sure you reread things. Well, no, it's not true. There are suggestions about going back and revising things and stuff, but only in a very general sense. But that's not what they do anyway. They revise it as they go.
This is an amazing data set. That's my last comment.
Yeah. Steve. Oh. There was one.
You sure? I'll be quick now, which is almost impossible.
Yeah.
Really lovely. The biggest category by far was self-initiated self-correction. Correction on repair, right? So, and this gets at the data, the big data question in a way. How much heterogeneity is there in that category? And if you're looking at epistemic progression, and I know that it's very valuable and many people are thrilled with the Epistemic project, and I'm not critiquing it necessarily, I'm just coming to terms with some of the things that it highlights, which is things like epistemic progression, very useful, understanding the ecological asymmetries associated with knowledge between interlocutors, for example, or whatever. It's all potentially very helpful, but the plus minus is so binary.
Yeah.
And I know that this is almost this is not new, but so within that category, for example, one of the big ones, right? Movement toward like epistemic progression, is it the same thing if it takes twice as long? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or I guess I'm just wondering, within the context of big data and micro-interactional sequential analysis, and trying to wet these, when is it really the same thing?
Yeah. I think this case with Scissorhands was, because I was struggling a bit there, to be perfectly honest, because it was, okay, well, I want to do something which is visually easy to grasp, but K plus minus, that's not what I've written in the article, because this seems to be stepwise process that I'm trying things out, so I'm not quite sure. So I think I put K question mark there. I'm not quite sure, but let's try this.
That's the reason I'm asking.
Yeah.
You sort of clearly were saying it's kind of a Zade fuzzy set.
Yeah.
That it's a hypothesis generation, hypothesis
Yeah.
testing, return to fail state, new hypothesis
Yeah.
generation. new hypothesis testing, successful return to failure state.
Yeah.
You know, which is really cool to see. I mean, I
Yeah,
love that
yeah.
piece of data. It just doesn't seem to obviously fit precisely
No.
into, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, I was struggling with it.
What do we do
Yeah.
about that?
Well, I didn't write it in the article. It was just for this purpose. Yeah, and I almost sort of regretted it part of the way through, but I was, yeah, because it's binary as well. And I mean, we're on our way, but each step maybe, yeah, you're still not there.
You know what it's not?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
what it's not is also kind of a partial move.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so I thought that was a lovely, really interesting, both your analysis of the empirics of the situation.
Yeah.
You were discussing there. That was a really neat case.
I think I've got to go back to that. It hasn't been published yet, but it's gone to be, well, I'm not sure, reviewed again, I think, but I've got a chance to change that, because I think that is worth making a point, an additional point, that it isn't just straightforward, like epistemic progression, always going in one direction. It could, in fact, turn as well. There could be other ways in which this trajectory could go, potentially. Thank you.
More, an independent paper.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And that would be a nice contribution to the broader epistemic project, I think, and a needed one.
Yeah.
It might bring other people who are currently less behind to see its potential.
Yeah.
Because I do think there's quite a bit of potential, but I have also been somewhat swayed by the critiques.
I'm going to return to the vocabulary stuff, which could be an example of the sort of parallel project there on Rabble, because they actually look it up in the end. And so part of the way it's sorting out, well, what do you mean? And then we get definitions, and there's lots of interesting stuff going on. Yeah.
Decided it was a real word.
Yeah.
The question of, is this a word?
Yeah, she says I'll decide it is now, but then they don't, because the other one starts looking. It's rabbla in Swedish, so it's close calc on Swedish, and then the other one looks up when she's worked out what she means. She looks up the Swedish word to find the word in English. So again, stepwise progression and sorting out. So I'm going to be looking at vocabulary next. That's my next project in this collaborative writing.
In a way, isn't this the holy grail of learning science?
Yes,
Learning.
Yeah.
How do you demonstrate where can you trace this place of coming into knowledge or
Yeah.
sort of the whole thing?
Yeah, well, I think that's where methodology, see more narrowly, and some other methods too, really shine, right? It's within that learning sciences framework. So, yeah, I think it's a really, I concur with about the quality and excitement we have around this collection. Painstakingly, laboriously.
Yeah.
I know we've talked about this a couple of times, big project.
Yeah. Don't give me more projects to do with this data. I'm so fed up with it now. But no, now you've got to the end of it.
One and done, finish it.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah. Did you want to? No.
Several minutes. Unless you're just dying for a coffee with this cold. Any final
I would ask another question.
Please do.
Nigel, like, you're almost there, you're almost ready for confidence. So, this is something, again, we talked about usually quite late in the evening, over the last few evenings, but and you didn't address this issue, so I don't feel like you need a polished response, but, where is agency in this scenario?
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
the human exceptionalism that I'll talk about and problematize somewhat in my presentation later tonight is alive and well in CX, right? So when you're talking about even the displaced agency of an algorithm, it is producing actions it would be very problematic for CA or other methodology to say that they're not actions. Right? So they are actions, but where is that an agentic dynamic and even non-human network of actions, or is it something else?
But I think it's very definitely, in this case, it's initiating repair, which is one of the participants in this potentially triadic ecology with it's displayed. So it's so obvious, and they respond to it, and verbally, so it gets treated as an agent. But when it goes all wrong, like it did in the case with Scissorhands, it can't do the work that the guy who said, okay, it skipped the A. Oh, right, there was another A. And seeing oh no, not that one, and skip the A in lead, where what you would normally do in correction process, a more precisioned, when it goes wrong, and when it goes completely wrong, then you step in where he takes over but of course the computer can't do all that. It hasn't got any algorithms to make it finely tuned for, well, what exactly did you do wrong this time? It can either say it's wrong, underlined, and perhaps it can provide, if it's right enough through the algorithms that are in there, that it can predict maybe what word, well, in that list menu, but it's got rather limited agency compared to the typist, and compared where they can request at any point, oh, I don't know how to spell, they can do all sorts of things, whereas the agency of the computer is actually limited to a few things, which can be useful, but it only signals that there's a problem. And that's where I think, in fact, there's a bit more potential for learning that, well, I've still got to fix it. The typist has still got to fix it somehow and identify, well, where is the problem? And then you can draw on different resources, which we saw in this case by dividing words and say, oh, well, this is where I think the problem is. So I will attack this one, and it's somewhere here, I think. So you can try out new things to try and identify it. So the typist has far more agency, say, than the computer does in this case. The occasions when you get this case, computer-initiated computer, where the computer actually makes the corrections, but they're quite rare. They tend to be when a full stop has come and then the beginning of the next sentence. They tend to be very, very common words like and but, and so it doesn't do it in many cases actually. So that's where agency is full on.
And one of the answers that intrigued me was that not using technology, it is working as a collaborative effort with technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this sort of, in a way, this exemplifies it. It's going beyond, and it makes you think of, I don't know, maybe cyberborgs or something, but that wasn't what they were going at. They were going at, no, we need to learn how to, a partnership was the word they used.
Yeah.
To partner.
Well, it's interesting that they actually do precisely that. So very rarely, yeah. So very rarely do they do this right click. It's like, I'll have another go. And sort of fix it myself. So I mean, there is this diagnostic, well, something is wrong, I think it's going to be this. So, and this works quite differently for, say, the spell checker or the function that you have in Google if you do a Google search, because it says, do you mean this? And suggestions come up while you're writing. So that actually is a bit different. So often you get there a bit quicker, but I don't know. In Word, they've decided not to go in that direction, but more like you fix it with this sort of flagging of errors.
Which is quite different from, I'm sure, everyone has this experience with WhatsApp. I've put mine as language. The language preference is English. So if I'm ever trying to enter something in Catalan or Spanish, I take forever. It's always changing my syntax.
Yeah, predictive. Yeah, too much agency. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your questions.